Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I hope you all already have this report that is being published today. We have here Foreign Minister Erkki Tuomioja, Rapporteur Mr. Terje Rød-Larsen from IPI, and also Director General of the Political Department of the Foreign Ministry of Finland, Mrs. Kirsti Kauppi. We will first hear a short statement by the Foreign Minister and Mr. Rød-Larsen, and then we have questions and answers. Any requests for interviews, please make yourself known to Mr. Keijo Norvanto, who is there, so he can then organize that. But without further ado, Mr. Foreign Minister, please.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. After the Security Council election in October, we in the Ministry decided to commission an analysis of the election and all the election campaign and the election situation from the International Peace Institute. The purpose and aim was to have an independent, impartial and external analysis of the election, with the aim of assessing the results of the election and to improve our understanding of the dynamics and attitudes among UN member states in relation to the election. The president of the International Peace Institute, Mr. Terje Rød-Larsen, was chosen to undertake the research. The IPI is a New York-based think tank with a wide range of expertise relating to all UN and multilateral cooperation issues and an extensive network of contacts, and we considered that the Institute was the best to be the competent author of this report. The IPI has prepared its report independently. Our ministry has not in any way influenced the contents of the report, and all views in the report are those of Mr. Rød-Larsen and the IPI. So, Terje, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foreign Minister, and thank you for inviting me to present IPI's report on last year's elections to the Security Council. I'd like to first say that this is the first time in the history of the United Nations that any candidate to the Security Council has commissioned an independent report on the election campaign. And I think this speaks volumes about, I think I should say, Finland's legendary courage and also Finland's hardcore principles of accountability and transparency towards its own public and its own people. And I would like to say that we have interviewed about 50 different countries about this, and without any exception, you have become an object of admiration because of your principles of transparency and accountability. I would also say that regardless of Finland's loss for its bid to the Security Council seat, Finland's standing at the United Nations in the Secretariat and amongst the membership is stellar. Let me then say that the present study was undertaken by the International Peace Institute, IPI, who's been supported by Finland for its 43 years of existence, at the request of the Foreign Ministry of Finland. Its objective is to provide an independent assessment and lessons learned, it's forward-looking, of the 2012 elections for the Western European and others group, the WEOG seats at the Security Council. IPI interviewed, as I said, more than 50 delegates and senior officials from all regional groups in member states' missions in New York and in capitals, as well as a few independent experts, and I personally spoke to 12 different foreign ministers about the issue. Most of these interviews took place in February and March this year. All of them were concluded on a strictly confidential basis. The delegates and officials we interviewed shared their views in the most candid way. IPI is, as the Foreign Minister mentioned, an international not-for-profit think tank. We conduct our work in an independent and impartial way. I'm grateful to the government of Finland for trusting us with this study and for its willingness to promote transparency and accountability on the issue of elections. These are matters that are sensitive for all UN member states. Our study aimed at analyzing the electoral campaign and identifying lessons learned for Finland, but also for its close partners in the Nordic states and of the European Union, and for the larger membership of the United Nations. And let me here say that we looked at three issues. The first issue is what I call the structural issues. The second set of issues are the strategy and tactics employed, and the third are the personalities which were which were employed for the campaign. The structural issues are related to the fact that Finland had to compete on one hand not only with the country Australia but with the continent with huge resources, and on the other hand it had to compete with one of the smallest states of Europe and a fellow member of the European Union. And then Finland also became into a situation where it had to compete with another member state of the European Union, namely Luxembourg. And then Finland also was in a situation where Nordic issues, which I will come back to, were glued to its campaign. And these Nordic issues had an ambiguous effect on Finland's campaign. These structural issues, and I will come back to it, in our opinion, made it extremely difficult for Finland to win its bid for the Security Council. And I would like also to say very clearly here that we do not consider this to be a Finnish issue, we consider it to be a Nordic issue, because the Nordic countries are in exactly the same position as Finland. And this is illustrated by Iceland's loss for its Security Council bid, and is illustrated by Sweden's loss in its bid for the Human Rights Council. So at the heart of the matter here is a Nordic issue and a European Union issue. And regardless of the strategies and the tactics and the personalities, our opinion is that for any Nordic Council in the current geopolitical situation at the United Nations, it will be very difficult for any Nordic country actually to win a seat in the Council. And this is at the heart of the matter, and I will elaborate on this in a minute. In our study, we looked at the various dimensions of the campaigns of the three candidates, namely, as you know, Australia, Finland, and Luxembourg. We looked at the themes of the campaigns, we looked at the strategies, we looked at the resources, we looked at the tactics, and we looked at the ideologies and the attitudes. And also at ethical dilemmas the candidates had to face. And let me say from the start that the outcome of the elections was largely unpredictable, seen with hindsight. In hindsight, we can now identify what differentiated the three candidates, but these differences were not as obvious at the time of the campaign. All three candidates led very active campaigns, and all three had a good UN record. So we tried to identify what made the difference. So let me summarize the main findings of IPI's report. First, the campaign themes. All three candidates developed similar campaign themes that emphasized their respective contributions to the work of the United Nations. Finland was, as I've already underlined, was placed in an unusual configuration. It had to compete at one hand with a country the size of a continent, and on the other with one of Europe's smallest states. it is more difficult to campaign when you're, so to speak, in the middle, because it's more difficult to appear different. In a way, Finland fell between chairs because it had a continent on one hand and one of Europe's smaller states on the other hand. There were sensitivities within the UN about the representation of European Union countries on the Security Council. As you know, Europe has 2 permanent seats in the Security Council, and then to have 2 new countries into the Council was considered very problematic by many member states. And this played in favor of Australia's candidacy and led Finland and Luxembourg, 2 European Union countries, to compete with one another. Let me then say a few words about strategies. Finland focused its strategy on UN issues. Australia's strategy was to complement its discourse on UN policies with an emphasis on its bilateral and regional relationships with member states. It led Australia an exceptionally active campaign both in New York and in capitals. And I'd like to say that this was very much driven by Australia's loss to the Security Council in 1996, which led to a national trauma. So there was an energy driven by that loss in the Australian campaign, which was very fierce and very energetic, because they wanted to rectify their experience from 1996. Luxembourg prioritized cultivating ambassadors in New York while keeping close and constant contact at the ministerial level. And of course, one of the advantages with a country like Luxembourg is that the umbrella of its foreign policies is much more narrow than Finland's, which means that the Foreign Minister of Luxembourg, our good friend Jean Asselborn, could devote an enormous amount of his time to do campaigning himself, which is impossible for Nordic foreign ministers because the range of their activities are so much broader. Luxembourg enlisted support from small states, from the Francophonie, and Portuguese-speaking countries. The reason being that Luxembourg has a vast number of citizens of Portuguese origin, so they have a special relationship to Portuguese-speaking countries. And also they campaign very actively from continental EU members. Australia was endorsed by the Forum of the Pacific and by CARICOM, which is the Organization for Caribbean States, and had access to members of the British Commonwealth and received solid support in Asia and Africa, and also from some European countries. Finland could not rely, as Australia and Luxembourg did, on cultural and historical ties to build its constituency. It was supported by the Nordics, the Baltic states, and CARICOM, but received insufficient support from the least developed countries, in particular in Africa, and did not receive full backing from EU members. Let me then say a few words about resources. Australia mobilized important resources for its campaign with a budget of $25 million over 5 years, covering all of its costs. Finland and Luxembourg spent, to put it understated, much less, although available information relating to their campaign budget does not include expenses for additional staff. Let me then say, have a few remarks about the tactics of the 3 different campaigns. Australia had announced its candidacy in 2008 and started its campaign almost immediately. It repeatedly checked pledges of support at all levels and stepped up its efforts in the last 2 years of the campaign. Luxembourg had declared its candidacy in 2001. It started its actual campaign in 2008 and progressively managed to establish very strong credibility. Finland had declared its candidacy in 2002, but its campaign only started in 2009 at the end of Iceland's own campaign to the Security Council. And this was a difficulty for Finland because it could not start its campaign before the elections to the Security Council related to Iceland's candidacy, which failed, was over. So the Finnish campaign team could not start its full-speed activities before 2009. Once launched, the Finnish campaign was at first very effective, but maybe less effective at the end of the campaign. A question remains, and we heard different views about it, whether Finland competed less actively in the last phase of the campaign at a moment when its competitors intensified their outreach. Then a few words about ideologies and attitudes. Australia was aware that its political proximity to the United States and its own positions on the Middle East, they traditionally have a very pro-Israeli stance, could be considered as weaknesses in their campaign and worked to limit possible damages to its candidacy. Luxembourg is traditionally seen as favoring consensual views and did not have issues of concern. Finland enjoyed a generally positive image as a Nordic country, but too focused on UN issues as compared with bilateral issues, and its campaign did not communicate enough about Finland's own achievements and identity. Then about ethics. All three candidates seem to have refrained from committing to defend specific positions at the Council that would not be consistent with their traditional policies. Finland's long track record as an important donor was an asset, but probably to a lesser degree than for its competitors. Almost half of Finland's ODA, that is Overseas Development Assistance, is delivered through multilateral channels and hence less visible, so to speak, than that of Australia and Luxembourg. Then, as I said initially, our report is forward-looking. So let me now say a few words about lessons learned for Finland, for the Nordics, for the European Union, and for the larger membership of the United Nations. For Finland. Finland should remain engaged in the work of the United Nations and on the international scene. As I said earlier, Finland has a stellar image at the United Nations and in the broader international community, and it has a very solid platform to build on. It should use the lessons learned from the campaign to build on its strengths and adapt, when needed, its diplomatic tools. So last year's elections have not at all tarnished the good image of the country at the United Nations. So Finland should continue to do what it does. But it can even do more and should review ways to revive its participation in peace operations and to bring support to efforts to address crises, in particular in Africa. Finland could seize the current opportunity to reflect on its international profile, on what makes this profile different or similar to the ones of its closest partners, and on ways to communicate more effectively about what it stands for and what it does. Finland's substantial diplomatic network is a strong asset. But the campaign has revealed a few weaknesses, in particular in Francophone Africa, and a certain deficit of communication with Arab countries. Finland could explore how to fill these gaps. Finland's ODA is a major asset and could perhaps be more clearly connected to its foreign policy. Finland could continue to prioritize the most effective use of its resources from a development perspective. By redeploying only a margin of its ODA to bilateral cooperation, Finland could reach out to a wider range of countries than it currently does. But this touches on fundamental dilemmas for any country's use of ODA. I am not at all promoting that Finland should drop its contributions to multilateral institutions, quite the contrary. It is extremely important with the multiple crises we have in the world today, with huge refugee problems, for instance, in the Middle East, that all countries continue to contribute fundamentally to multilateral assistance. But what I'm saying is that this is issues which has to be weighed, how much you use in bilateral assistance and how much you use in multilateral assistance. And this provides an opportunity, the current moment, for Finland to address these issues. Then let me move to lessons learned for the Nordic countries. Finland's defeat came at the same time as Sweden's failure to be elected to the UN Human Rights Council, and 4 years after Iceland's unsuccessful bid for a Security Council seat. Although each election has its own logic, many in New York consider these recent failures as somebody put it to us, as a wake-up call for the Nordics. The general opinion is that the current issues related to our topic today is not specifically a Finnish issue, it's a Nordic issue. Nordic states could reflect together on how a renewed commitment to the work of the UN and a more effective communication strategy could help them remain true to their values and at the same time engage more effectively with other countries. And let me here add, as you will also find in the report, that the Nordic brand 20 years ago was a huge asset for any Nordic country which was running for a seat in anything in the multilateral community. Today it is ambiguous, and it's related to two issues. One is that at the core of the Nordic values you find human rights, the rule of law, responsibility to protect, etc. But this is not necessarily today topics which rally support in campaigns. Everybody's paying lip service to it, but there are many countries who fundamentally dislike a moral pointing finger at their countries on these issues. This is why they prefer to have countries in the Security Council and elsewhere who are not pointing that besserwisser moral finger at them. And this is a problem for all European countries in election campaigns, but at the peak of the countries who have this problem in election campaigns, you find the Nordics. And I'm emphasizing again, this is not a Finnish issue, this is a Nordic issue. That is why when you look at election campaigning, this is a fundamental problem for all the Nordic countries. Then lessons learned for the European Union. Competition between EU members for elections at the Security Council or other major UN elections play against the interest of EU members themselves. A clear understanding among EU members that they need to work together to avoid electoral competition would strengthen the credibility of EU foreign policy. It would also help enhance its contribution to the work of the United Nations. This is not an anti-EU argument, it's basically an argument for telling the European Union members, get your act together. Then, lessons learned for UN membership. Based on our study, we will now go to the membership and say, do as Finland. Enhance transparency and accountability in election campaigns. And we also need to have a dialogue on the financing of development cooperation as a tool in election campaigns. And I think actually I will end my introduction with that, and I will take any question or any criticism you might feel like. Thank you so far.
Okay, Minister, would you like to say something?
Yes, just let me add one word. Given the very broad implications for all the Nordic countries that this candidature and this exercise has had, for which we were aware from the very beginning, I have talked with my Nordic colleagues and told them that we have commissioned this report, and it will be given also immediately to the Nordic colleagues, and I expect that we will have a thorough discussion of that at the next Nordic Foreign Ministers meeting in May.
Okay, thank you. And let me remind you that if you need additional copies of the report, you can download them from the Foreign Ministry website after this event. And now it's time for questions and answers. Okay, please.
Jarmo Mäkelä, Finnish Broadcasting Company. In the domestic debate in Finland, there were some references made to the fact that during the campaign, Finland had to close down some embassies due to simply domestic financial reasons. Did you come up with this problem anywhere in your talks with the other countries? Did anybody say that this was one of the reasons why they didn't want to vote for Finland?
No, we believe that we have a very representative sample of the UN membership, and none ever brought up this topic.
Okay.
Thank you. Lili Verda, I am a journalist, accredited journalist from Albania here. Thank you. You mentioned some points or some subjects like Francophonia or the EU membership for Luxembourg or Portuguese diaspora and so on. What about the kingdoms of the world? Because there are also, they are like relics, but still they are functioning. And Luxembourg is a kingdom. Also Australia has some connections and so on. Thank you.
Being a Norwegian, I couldn't possibly say that kingdoms is a relic, but I'm joking. No, actually, you have a point. Luxembourg very effectively campaigned amongst the different kingdoms of the world, based on Luxembourg being a duchy.
Olli Kivinen, I'm a retired journalist. You mentioned here that there's a great problem for the Nordic model as such, and so it can be interpreted that we try to sell an unsaleable product but what about the salesmen who are doing this? Did you see much accusation of, let's say, Nordic, not only Finnish, but Nordic besserwisserism and trying to put too forcefully our values and things like that in countries where these values are absolutely no-go? And you refer to that in the page 20 rather clearly. I'm really interested about this besserwisserism. Did you count much of that?
This is actually a very good question. And as I said, there are two issues here. One is ideology, and the other one is attitude. And I took very careful notice that you used the word besserwisser, because this was actually the word which was used by many we interviewed. And this is the attitude issue, that there is a fairly broad perception, particularly in the South, that the Nordics, and I emphasize again, this is the Nordics, that there is a besserwisser attitude, that we Nordics are displaying an attitude where we think we are morally superior to others, which represents a problem. Paradoxically, what we detected is that Finland is actually the country which is least perceived as carrying these attitudes of the Nordics. But this is why to brand yourself as Nordic is ambiguous. So in many ways, if Finland had run a campaign which was a pure Finnish campaign, probably you would have done better. And it's because in many countries, the other Nordics kind of represented Finland with the foreign ministries, etc. And that did not necessarily play to Finland's advantage. I mean, I know this is a fairly brutal thing to say, but it's unfortunately the truth of the matter. So what I'm saying is that the Nordics there is admiration for the Nordics at the UN because of our values, our development aid, the position we are taking on different issues, but there are ambiguities, which, to put it a bit brutally, that we are looking morally down at others. And there is an attitude problem here. And then it's also so that you also touched upon ideological issues here. That is that, as I said, to use, and I'm a true believer in the Nordic values, just to say that, but to campaign on it is not necessarily very effective. And here there are dilemmas here. I mean, you can, on the one hand, you can say we have to be principled. We have to campaign explicitly on our values and on our ideologies, but they are not very popular. So what some countries said, or representatives of countries which we interviewed said, look, it's foolish to campaign on it, but when you are in the council, you can stand tall. So, and these are hard dilemmas because it's about principles and it's about tactics and strategy. But so this is the ideology issue, but the attitude issue is also an issue. Let me be even more explicit. The Nordics are considered to be a bit arrogant.
Yes, good morning, and sorry to be late.
You don't have to introduce yourself.
Yes. So, knowing well the rotation inside the Nordic family, what is your opinion after your study concerning the refusing the withdraw your candidature? I mean, Sweden is in turn, and after refusing that, withdrawing their candidature, and maybe Finland could reconsider our candidature to run for the next time. What is your opinion after this study? Is it worth to make any final conclusions in this sense?
I think it would be inappropriate for me to give advice on which country to run or not to run, but I think the foreign minister has done exactly the right thing, namely to call for a meeting amongst the Nordic foreign ministers to address the issue. And the issue is not Finland's loss, it's Iceland's loss and it's Sweden's loss. I mean, there is now an opportunity to address these issues because there is a problem here. And it's not Finland's problem, it's a Nordic issue. And this is why the Nordic Foreign Ministers Forum is the right place to address it.
Any more questions from the floor? Okay, please.
Janne Vass, Hufvudstadsbladet. There was some debate after the defeat that one of the reasons would have been that the Finnish development aid was not up to the UN standard of 0.7% of the GNI. How large a role, if any, do you think that played?
And we did not detect that this has been an issue at all. I don't think it had any effect whatsoever on the campaign. I think there was one issue which might have an effect, that is that all the Nordic countries have much less participation, dramatically less participation in peacekeeping operations than we had before. But again, this is a Nordic issue. But let me use your question as an opportunity to elaborate a little bit on this. What many pointed out is that to promote and to communicate your UN credentials, and Finland has super UN credentials, does not in itself generate votes. It's a platform you can stand on. It's the bilateral relations which count.
More questions? Would you like to comment on any of the issues that came up here?
No, I think I've actually said my bit and read the report. And Originally I was supposed to leave Finland today, but I'm staying today. So if any of you want to talk to me on an individual basis, I'm open-minded about it.
Mr. Minister, any closing remarks?
Well, I want to thank the IPI and Terje Rød-Larsen for the work which we all appreciate very much and which will be, I know, put to good use here in Finland, but also among the Nordic countries. There are a lot of details also in the report which I think will be beneficial, but mostly we will treat them as a lessons learned operation. So if and when we are a candidate to anything next time, we know how to do slightly better.
May I just, I would like to say, Mr. Foreign Minister, that you have also personally received an enormous admiration from the member states at the UN because of the initiative you took to have an independent and impartial analysis of the election campaign of last year. And I think you have actually set a new standard for how member states operate based on the principles of transparency and accountability. So I think it was an admirable thing to do, and you have received lots of admiration in the international community for doing it.
Perhaps one thing which came out also in the report has not been so much mentioned here now is that the nature of UN elections has changed in the past 10, 20 years. Compared with 20 years ago, campaigns are run in a very different way, and the setting is very different. And I'm not sure that the changes have been for the better. There is very little that one can do about this in the short term, but I think we have to recognize this as well.
Well, Mr. Kivinen wanted to have one more for the road. Please be...
Thank you, sir. As there seems to be time for another question, I would like to come back to the page 20, and where you say, and the Nordic model, and where there's one key sentence, which is, but the world has changed. What would be your advice to the Nordic countries, not only Finland, to do? Because, as you said, it's a great dilemma between our values and the exceptions of those values. Should we restrict them, or should we just play a little bit softer line in questions like women's rights and freedom of expression, which you mentioned here especially, which are very valuable to us?
A couple of comments on that. One is that the multilateral institutions, particularly the United Nations, is more important now than I think it ever was since its inception. With the multiple conflicts we have in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, and also in Asia, those three areas in particular. And there is no other way to address many of these issues but through multilateralism. And this is why it is even more important for the Nordic countries, who's been carrying these values for all the years, of more than 60 years of the UN's existence, to continue to do it. But as the Foreign Minister mentioned, the campaigns for not only the Security Council but for various positions in the multilateral system has become harder, and there are ramifications for how to run campaigns which has to be discussed. And these ramifications are touching upon ethical issues, what instruments is it legitimate to deploy, and what instruments are illegitimate to deploy, and it's issues of transparency. And here Finland today is an example which everybody's looking at, the transparency issues. And I think this is a time where member states should have a look at the ramifications for elections. What resources is it legitimate to deploy? What is illegitimate to deploy? What instruments are legitimate and what are illegitimate? And there should be a call for more transparency about campaigns.
And from my part, I'm happy that you saw our amazing widescreen show. Here you were able to see our latest edition. And question of money will, of course, come to play. The price of this report was $27,595. so you don't need to ask. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Rød-Larsen. Thank you, Kirsti Kauppi, and thank you for you all. And now, please, Keijo Norvanto will organize the individual interviews.
On Thursday. Do you want to write a personal